I'm Mbweha, you can call me Ben of Team Relentless, and this is how cover works in Star Wars Legion. When we're talking about cover in Legion, we need to talk about two major things. One is during setup, how we define the terrain that's on the table, and two is how to actually determine cover when making an attack. And we're going to be doing both of those things in this video, but we're going to start with declaring terrain during setup right now. Broadly speaking, there are three types of terrain in Star Wars Legion. There's area terrain, scatter terrain, and then large line of sight blockers. For each piece of terrain that's on the table, you need to declare whether it grants no cover, light cover, or heavy cover. And then you also need to say to what units it will grant its cover. And you also need to say if it impedes the movement of troopers, ground vehicles, or repulsor vehicles, or none of those things. So those are the things that you need to talk about with every piece of terrain that's on the board for every type of unit that's being used in the game. Now that might seem like it's a little bit overwhelming for having to have this big long conversation about every little piece, which is why it's nice to have some standard expectations about how this should work. So there are suggestions in the RRG for how to do this, and we're going to go over them really quickly right now, just so that we're all on the same page. When it comes to if it is no cover, light cover, or heavy cover, usually the only type of terrain that grants no cover is something like open water. Light cover tends to be things that you could see through that aren't going to completely block line of sight. Those tend to be light cover. And then things that completely block line of sight that you can't see through at all tend to be heavy cover. Now there are exceptions. For example, if this was a light cover piece of area terrain, but as I'm designing the table, I think it would be more interesting if it was a heavy cover area terrain, I could just put more pieces there and just say this is heavy cover, and I'm visually reminding everyone of that by making it more dense with the vegetation in there. Hills are something that most people tend to play as heavy, but the suggestion is actually that it is light. So you just need to make sure that you talk to your opponent ahead of the game so that you all know what you're expecting with light versus heavy and what it's going to grant its cover to. So after you know if the piece of terrain is going to be no cover, light cover, or heavy cover, that you then have to determine what units will benefit from that cover. Usually the easiest way to do this is to check the highest point on the piece of terrain. So over here for my area terrain, I would have, it's actually this tall and all the way filled in is the way that area terrain works. Or, one of these trees, the tallest point, or the hill, the tallest point, and those types of things. And usually what you say is, if the piece of terrain is half the height of the unit leader or taller, then it will grant its cover to that unit. So for example, this ATST is big and tall, and so it's not going to get to benefit from most of the terrain that we see here. For example, this big hill in front of it is not taller than half of its height if we measure it. So it's more than twice as tall than the hill, so it will not get the cover from the hill no matter what. Whereas something like this tree, this tree actually is, quite a bit taller than half of it, and so it would get the light cover from the tree, presumably, so long as that's what you and your opponent agree ahead of time. So that's usually the best way to do it. Now sometimes there can be a little bit of confusion about that because of vehicles that are on flight stands. The vehicles that are on the flight stands, when you're firing at them, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but when we're talking about actually targeting them, you only actually look at the model. So when you're actually firing at the snowspeeder, you only look at the snowspeeder itself. You ignore all of the base and the flight stand. Most everything else, you look at the base and the model. The exception, of course, being now small base troopers. You use a silhouette for every small base trooper, whether it's R2-D2 or whether it's Tristan Wren up on a flight stand. You use that silhouette to determine all this stuff. So when you're using this, I do still suggest that you just go by half the height of the whole model for whether or not it's going to benefit. And quite often, even if you say like, okay, well this is taller than half of it, there's going to be a lot of situations where this doesn't actually block line of sight at all because it's up on the flight stand. But again, it tends to go very smoothly to say if a piece of terrain is half the height or taller than the Mini, then it's going to benefit from the type of cover that it grants. As far as how they obstruct movement, that's outlined in the RRG. The suggestions are there, and you can really make it interesting, but try to make it make sense and be memorable for players. So largely speaking, you know, if it looks like it's wide open area terrain, it probably shouldn't be difficult to move through. If you make it really dense, now it would make sense for it to be difficult for troopers, but probably an ATST can just walk right through the grass without any problem. You start making the area terrain so that instead it's you know, wooded, and now you can maybe be worried about it might be difficult for ground vehicles to walk through these because they actually have to go around the trees instead of just walking through the grass. But that is ultimately up to you and your opponent. But I do suggest you do things that make sense, and that you do things that follow the guidelines in the RRG. I also want to point out that barricades are a special set of scatter terrain that don't always follow those rules. So barricades are actually defined in the RRG for what they grant their cover to. So they grant, for example, they grant them to small base troopers, all small base troopers they grant heavy cover to, and to Droideka, and even to all emplacements. So even though I don't know that this is actually would meet the height suggestions, in the rulebook it clearly says that barricades are going to provide heavy cover to emplacement troopers. So that FD cannon there would in fact have heavy cover from a barricade, which makes it great to place it behind a barricade if you can. Okay, so you've declared terrain and now you're actually playing the game, shots are being fired, and so you need to check to see if something is going to actually get cover. This is essentially done in a 3-step process. The first thing that you need to do is you need to check the line of sight of the attack. So from the attacker's point of view, you look and you check to see, can they see the defenders? Can they see the minis in the defending unit? And when they're looking at the mini in the defending unit, is there any terrain that is impeding the view at all? I like to say that is obstructing the view. That's not a term that's in RRG, but I like to say it's obstructed. So for example, and I'm gonna move the camera, we're gonna get to see down close several examples, but just for a basic example, if we have you know, the FD cannon firing at R2-D2 because he's betrayed the rebellion or whatever. If there is a piece of scatter terrain like this right there, when we get down and we look from this perspective, if any part of this silhouette is impeded at all by a piece of terrain, I like to say, okay, that piece of terrain has obstructed the target. Now that doesn't mean that it's going to get cover from that piece of terrain yet. There's another step you have to do. So you check the line of sight, and then if there's any piece of terrain that's obstructing line of sight, you then have to imagine a 2-dimensional plane going from the center of the attacking unit to the center of that mini. And if that 2-dimensional plane also intersects the piece of terrain that was causing the obstruction, then we say it is obscured. And obscured is a word in the RRG that by definition means that it's getting the benefit of cover from a piece of terrain. So at that point, it is going to get the cover bonus, assuming that at the beginning of the game it was agreed upon that that particular piece of terrain would grant its cover bonus to something like R2-D2, to a small base trooper. Now it's also worth noting that this is not the only area terrain in the game. Ground vehicles are area terrain, so that same shot going through the ATST's legs right here is going to give R2-D2 light cover because it's a ground vehicle with legs. Ground vehicles with treads usually grant heavy cover. And creature troopers are the same thing. So this creature trooper, this tauntaun, could be obstructing the shot and then cause it to be obscured. And again, you have to remember with area terrain, imagine that this is actually a cylinder that goes up to this guy's head. The tail that's poking out of the cylinder doesn't matter at all. It's only the shape of the base filled in up to the highest point on the mini. And that's true for all area terrain. It's true for all emplacement troopers. It's true for all ground vehicles, and it's true for all creature troopers. The only other thing I want to say quickly about that is please note that emplacement troopers and creature troopers, while they can obscure line of sight, causing their cover to be granted, they cannot block line of sight. You can see through them, even through this big, thick satellite dish. That line of sight, you can pretend that the satellite dish is invisible when you are checking line of sight. It's only vehicles that can actually block line of sight entirely. So if a trooper's standing up on this hill and trying to shoot through the ATST's head, it's actually possible that the ATST makes the shot impossible. But in the case of emplacement troopers and creature troopers, you can pretend that they are an invisible zone of area terrain that you can always see through, even if the model actually looks like it's obstructing it. And that can confuse people a lot at first, and it's one of those I gotcha moments that players who have played a little bit more really don't like to have with new players. We don't want to surprise somebody when I thought I was safe and you're not. So keep that in mind. We want to make sure that we know those rules so that we're not surprising people with the attacks we're making. One other quick note about making a ranged attack. I mentioned that there are largely 3 steps. Remember that if the unit leader is touching the piece of terrain that is causing the obstruction, it's ignored. So you can ignore the piece that you're touching when it comes to if the obstruction counts or not. Now, that doesn't mean that you can, if you're touching a building, see through it, because it can actually fully block line of sight. So you still have to be able to see a piece of the model to shoot it. You have to be able to see a piece of the miniature that you're firing at, so you can't see through walls. But you can see through FD dishes, and you can see through tauntauns if you're up against them and touching them. So that would look right through them, and they wouldn't get the benefit of cover. So just to make sure that I'm entirely clear about that, again, let's imagine that same shot. If this tauntaun were in base contact with the laser cannon here, if the laser cannon is firing at R2-D2, even though it is obstructing the view, even though that straight 2-dimensional plane would absolutely go through the tauntaun, because the unit leader, which is the whole FD cannon in this case, is touching this piece of area terrain, it is ignored. And so the shot would be in the open, as opposed to if it's just moved like this, now it's going to be a shot in light cover. So that is a note about the things that you can see through and the things that you can't see through. Alrighty, I'm going to grab the camera and we're going to go through some hypothetical ranged attacks and talk about what type of cover would be granted and how it would maybe be just slightly different if things were moved around. Yeah, let's get to that. Alrighty, we're gonna imagine Chewbacca here is firing at both the droidicas, and then and we're imagining that if he were firing at the tauntauns as well. We're gonna take a look at what the difference here would be between those two things. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get down and check from the silhouette, from the top of that little mark on the silhouette, not from the top of Chewbacca's head, but from the silhouette. If he's targeting the droidicas, is there any piece of terrain that is in the way? And yes, we cannot see the base and the lower parts of the droidica because of the barricade in front of them. And so because we can't see the barricade, we then bother asking the question, do we care? Do barricades grant cover to droidica? And we say, yes, they do. We agreed at the beginning of the game that we'd follow the rules. And so they do, in fact, grant heavy cover to them, so long as the 2-dimensional plane from the center of Chewbacca's base to the center of the droidica base is there. So if we kind of have to go up here and look and imagine that straight line, a lot of the times I like to, some people have lasers for this because they're very fancy. I just use my range ruler and go like this. Okay, that 2-dimensional plane would go through it, and that 2-dimensional plane would also go through the barricade. So the barricade is granting its heavy cover to both models. So this is going to be a shot into heavy cover. let's imagine that this were the case. Now, this is the leader. Let's imagine the leader were here and that the non-leader mini was right there. So now, when we did this check, notice that we would say, okay, the lower, what's on the screen is the lower right-hand part of the base of the Droideka is obstructed by this barricade. But I have to then, now when I check this line, you see that the two-dimensional plane would not go through the barricade. The two-dimensional plane that goes from the center of Chewbacca's base to the center of that base would not go through the barricade. So this model would have no cover. It's in the open. But its friend here still is going to have heavy cover. Now, the way that it works is if there's a mixture of the different types of cover for a unit that has multiple miniatures in it, it's basically, it's gonna have cover if half or more of the minis in the unit have cover. And if there's still multiple types of cover within that, it's majority rules. So if there were a 6, well, I'll just do an example of that later. For now, we'll say it's this. Now, let's imagine that Chewbacca takes this mini out, and then he fires next round like this. Now the unit is in the open, right? Because the only model in the unit, that two-dimensional plane from center to center doesn't go through the barricade, and so now it's going to be in the open because it lost this. So that's why usually it's a good idea to try to make sure that the unit leader has cover because it's going to be the last thing there. So that would have been a better way of deploying those, or putting those Droidekas down, making sure that the unit leader, if it's by itself, will still have heavy cover. Now, if I was firing at the Tauntauns, the situation is a little bit different. We would say, okay, when we get down here and we check, absolutely, there's parts of the Tauntauns that we cannot see because of that barricade. And sure enough, that two-dimensional plane would go through the barricade, but we don't care. Why don't we care? Because the barricade does not grant its heavy cover to creature troopers. That's just straight up in the rules. So we would have agreed to that at the beginning of the game as well. So and it makes sense, right? It's way less than half the height, which is sort of the rule of thumb for how to do that. So that's not going to have any cover there. So that's examples 1 and 2. Okay, now we've got the AT-ST out, and the AT-ST is going to be attacking Chewbacca, and we're also going to talk about attacking the Tauntauns from this position. So the first thing that we need to do, we check from the AT-ST fires from kind of this point right here, kind of its highest point is what you're supposed to do. It's supposed to be highest point or the center of the model, but people, twist them around, so you just do your best. You can see from this perspective. Alrighty, I have to interrupt myself real quick because I was about to tell a lie. You can see here that the silhouette is totally unobstructed by the barricade. However, Chewbacca's base is. And I got confused about silhouettes, as many of us often do. And I was thinking that because the silhouette was in the open, that Chewbacca was in the open. But when you use silhouettes, you also still care about the base of the mini. So when you use a silhouette, you still care about the base of the mini. Can't say that often enough. The only thing that you ignore is the miniature itself and the terrain on top of it. So you can see the front of Chewbacca's base is obstructed visually by the barricade, and then the center line is going to totally go through the barricade, so he's going to have heavy cover there. If he were to be slid back about a ½ inch, then he would be in the open because the AT-ST would have the high ground. Now let's imagine that we're firing at the Tauntauns over here. This would be a situation that I think a lot of new players get a little bit confused about. You need to remember that this piece of area terrain, you need to imagine that it is the shape of the base up to its highest point, totally filled in solid. It's like as if this could be anywhere on it. It doesn't actually matter if this is in front of the Tauntauns. This just means that this whole zone is meant to be, that tall. So when I check to see if they're obscured, the way that it looks right now, it looks like, hey, those Tauntauns look like they're in the open, but they're actually not. Because, if this were over there, you can see if it's this tall, it absolutely would obstruct the view from the AT-ST to the base and a significant portion of both Tauntauns. So then I would have to check, okay, well, from center of base to center of base, does it go through it or not? And this one's kind of close. So certainly this leader is going to go right through the terrain right there. And then over here, I very carefully go center to center, and I'd have to, ooh, judge, it's really close. So in this particular case, it wouldn't matter because, half of them, the leader, is going to be benefiting from the terrain. And so they're going to have the terrain type that this was agreed ahead of the time, which I would assume this would be light terrain right here. And it is, it's as tall as the Tauntaun, so it certainly should apply to them as well. So that's our next example. Now let's do another. Alrighty, this is going to sort of be our flight stand example here. So we're going to imagine that these shore troopers are firing at something up over there by that hill. So you can see there's a T-47 and there's Staps and then there's Clan Wren over there. So let's talk about each of these shots respectively. So first of all, the hill is half the height or taller than all of these things. So just to get that out of the way, so we do care that the hill is there, so we do need to check the line of sight. I guess that's something you can do. If you know, like, it doesn't matter, this piece of terrain won't grant its cover anyway, then you don't really have to check it regardless. So in any case, let's say we go down here. Let's say I'm going to fire at the airspeeder first. So here I am, I check from right here, and I look over at the airspeeder, and at first you might think, oh, I can't see the base of the airspeeder, I can't see the flight stand, but you have to remember that with repulsor vehicles, you ignore the flight stand entirely. So the only thing that matters is the actual airspeeder model itself, and that actual airspeeder model itself is totally unobstructed by any piece of terrain. Therefore, it's not going to benefit from the cover of this hill. Let's go forward and look at the Staps. So it's kind of the exact same thing for the Staps, right? It might look like, oh, I'm sure those Staps are going to get cover up there, right? Because you can see that the person who put them there put them cleverly on the backside, thinking, oh yeah, now that they'll get they'll be obstructed or they'll be obscured by the hill. But actually, no, you have to get pretty close for it to obstruct it. You can see from this angle that the Staps themselves are totally visible. And so regardless of not being able to see the base, this would also be a shot into the open. Now over here, remember, flight stands on small base troopers don't matter. We should be using a silhouette here to determine if there's cover. So you can imagine, a silhouette being dropped in behind here. In some cases you actually need it, but a lot of the times as you practice with the silhouettes, you won't actually need to put it out every single time. I'm actually going to move my leader here so we can try to get a really good view, and I can show you that when we actually get down here, you see how with if I put a silhouette on the back side of those bases, I would not be able to see the bottom of the silhouette. Even on Ursa, even on the leader, there would be, the hill would matter. So this high ground situation really does matter, and the hill, because the 2D plane, of course, is also going to go through the piece of terrain that's causing the visual obstruction, then we would say, they are obscured, and so they're going to benefit from the terrain. They're going to get the cover from the terrain that was agreed upon at the beginning of the game. Now, I want to show you real quickly how powerful it would be if this building were over here. And there was actually kind of a high ground shot, and I'm going to use, the whole unit won't fit on top of this building, but let's pretend that Chewbacca had, climbed up right here like this. And now, unfortunately, my silhouette doesn't really fit in there, so I kind of have to use my imagination. But you can see that from this perspective, the silhouettes on Clan Wren are no longer going to be obstructed at all by the hill. So Chewbacca is actually looking down at them now, and now this would be a shot that's in the open. So you have to keep in mind that the angle does matter. The other thing that matters is how close you are to the base. So we had that shore trooper, back here, and we're like, oh yeah, it's gonna block it. But if he gets far enough back, it's possible that the angle will change and that they might not have cover. It just sort of depends. Similarly, if we think about like those Staps and that T-47 being in the open, if we get really, really close, that won't be the case anymore. So if I'm actually firing from here, Now you can see a situation in which both the Snaps and the T-47 are actually obscured by the piece of terrain, and so when I draw that center line, they will benefit from the cover. So that's something to think about. It seems like, oh, because I only look at the T-47's actual miniature, it's never going to have cover. Well, it would from this hill if they're firing pretty close to it. So that's something that you need to keep in mind as well. All right, let's talk about a situation where you can't see some minis at all. So here you can see that the shore troopers are kind of tucked in behind this large line of sight blocking rock. So let's say this is my Droideka unit leader. So when I'm checking at first for line of sight, we can see that I can only see 3 models. So first of all, that means only 3 models are going to be eligible for damage. But it matters that there's a bunch of models that I can't see at all. The models that you can't see, they get heavy cover. Like they no matter what. Even if it was by a piece of terrain that you, for whatever reason, you've said, if we imagine that we said that this piece wasn't going to grant its cover to troopers for some strange reason, the fact that we cannot see those shore troopers at all means that they have heavy cover. If you can't see them at all, they have heavy cover no matter what, assuming it's coming from terrain. So, but as a note, and players figure this out pretty quickly, if this is my leader, what I do here is I put the other one over here, because now this one is not, the non-leader mini is not how I determine cover, but it does make more enemies eligible to receive damage. So now from this angle, we can see here that almost all of them are visible. Actually, probably the only one that can't be seen is, no, they can all be seen from here, actually. I know it seems strange, but when you get used to it, it doesn't take too long. But you can see a little bit of the base of the T-21 over there. And then if you kind of go up like this, you can see, well, if you can see that base of the T-21, you can see all the other stuff back there too. And of course, we should be using the silhouette to double check this. So that's why you'll see people use cohesion to swing out like this, and they'll increase the eligibility of minis. Now, similarly, if you were worried about trying to protect these Droideka more, if we kind of reverse this situation, if we have the leader over here, now if he just swings out that much, when we check this, we're going to have a whole bunch of stuff that's in the open when we do the straight line distance here. The two-dimensional plane from center to center is not going to touch this rock. It looks like it would probably catch it for 3 out of 6, so just barely it would get the heavy cover. But if I could get them over there, then all of a sudden they're going to be in the open. And if, let's imagine that there is a barricade that I'm trying to catch cover from, I could put my leader here and cohere this Droideka over here, so that if I get shot back at, that they're going to have heavy cover, because half the models will be behind the barricade. And this just needs to see at least 1 mini enabled in order to contribute its dice. So for a miniature to contribute dice to an attack, they do have to see something, which we've accomplished here now. So there's another example. Okay, I wanted to show you again kind of an actual example of how the FD cannon can create some confusing situations. Emplacement troopers are going to grant light cover to things that they obscure. So if I've got Chewbacca here firing at those shore troopers, absolutely it's making it difficult to see them, right? But remember that the emplacement trooper cannot actually block line of sight. So Chewbacca can see right through that dish. I know that is not intuitive, and that's why I'm highlighting it for us right now, is so that nobody is surprised that this is how it works. Not only does that not actually block his line of sight, but because he is in base contact with it, he's going to ignore it when he's checking for cover. So we would say, oh yeah, this FD cannon is, the zone of area terrain that it represents does in fact, obstruct Chewbacca's view of the shore troopers. However, he's touching it, and so it's not going to grant its light cover to him. And very common, again, to be confused about this and to think, well, he can't even see him. What the heck? It's because the only units that actually can block line of sight are ground vehicles like ATSTs and ATRTs and the tank and things like that. It's just ground vehicles that can actually block line of sight. So this would actually be a shot from Chewbacca in the open at those shore troopers. And if they fired back, he is going to benefit from the cover because they are not touching it. So he would have light cover from the emplacement trooper. Alrighty, so that's an overview of how cover works in Star Wars Legion. Don't forget that you need to talk about what type of cover every piece of terrain on the board provides, and then what will benefit from it. And then when you're making the attack, anytime you're making a ranged attack, check line of sight. If there's any terrain that is obstructing the view of a mini that is being targeted in the defending unit, then you need to check to see if a two-dimensional plane from the center of the attacker to the center of the defending mini would actually go through that piece of terrain or not. And if it does, then it's going to get the benefit of whatever type of terrain that is, assuming that at the beginning of the game, during setup, you said it was a piece of terrain that would grant its cover to that particular unit, and assuming that the attacking unit leader is not touching that piece of terrain. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them in the comments. Hit me up on Discord is totally fine as well. Cover is one of those things that quite often it's very confusing when you first start playing, and you start to get a good sense of it. You're like, oh, I get it. And then something will still surprise you later on. So that's normal, that's expected. Expect to be surprised from time to time as you're learning about how cover works in this game. I'm surprised from time to time still when I'm determining cover in games. I'll sometimes get something wrong. And so be open to that, be open to being wrong, and be open to learning new things about how to utilize cover best in Star Wars Legion. Really quickly, while you're still here, I want to talk to you about this building right here. This is called the Team Relentless Clubhouse, is what we affectionately refer to this as, and I built it mostly out of cardboard from the inserts that came in the expansions and some other stuff too. Well, since then, this little guy has turned into quite a little popular piece of terrain, and you can actually now buy a 3D printed version of it from 6up Supply. So I encourage you to head over to 6up Supply, take a look at the Team Relentless Clubhouse, take a look at all the awesome stuff that they sell at 6up, and yeah, you could have the Team Relentless Clubhouse on your very own table as well. Also, you can use the discount code RELENTLESS to get 10% off your purchase while you're at 6up Supply. So go ahead and do that because they're awesome. If you like the video, I hope you'll prove it and subscribe if you're into that sort of thing. I'm Mbweha, you can call me Ben of Team Relentless, and this has been How Cover Works in Star Wars Legion.